Going to be making a movie for you today because I am not going to be there for class on Friday. So it's Thursday and I'm in my office and my 2-year-old has the flu, so she is at home and will not be able to go to school tomorrow, so I will be home with her. However, we have an exam on Monday, and so I wanted to make sure that you had everything that you needed to have for that exam on Monday, even though I wasn't going to be there with you tomorrow. I also really hate that I'm not going to be able to kind of talk to you guys about your activity that you did on Wednesday before the exam. So if you have any questions about that, just send me an email so that I can be available to sort of answer those questions. I do want you to be able to do something like that for the exam, not necessarily in terms of doing each of the different approaches, but more in terms of me giving you a situation and then you explaining what kind of approach you would use and why. So just keep that in mind, that that's something you will need to be able to do. Okay, so we left off with the normative model. If you remember, we're talking about contingency models in chapter 4. We have 4 models that we have gone over, including the normative model. So we have Fiedler's contingency model, we have the leadership continuum model, we also have the path goal model, which we just talked about on Wednesday, and then we have the normative model. The leader substitutes theory I'm also going to talk about today, but I don't really consider that to be a formal model, which I guess you'll see in a couple minutes. Okay, so we talked about how the normative model really comes with 2 different models, right? So a time-driven model and then a development-driven model. And we talked about this a little bit just in terms of a time-driven model is driven by time, which makes sense, and a development-driven model is driven by development. So I'll talk a little bit more about what each of those means. So for a time-driven model, the focus is on time in the sense that time is very valuable in that situation. So the extent to which you're going to involve people in decision making is going to change depending on how much time you have, right? Whereas in a development-driven model, the follower's development is really important. So the leader really wants to make sure that they are developing the follower and helping them in every possible way they can and making them into a better worker and a better leader. So that is the focus for a development-driven model. Okay, so one thing about the normative model that makes it different from some of the other models is the fact that the normative model is focused on decision making. Okay, so this is our first model that's focused primarily on decision making. Fiedler's model and the leadership continuum model were focused on job performance. The path goal model was focused mostly on follower satisfaction and a little bit on job performance. And this model, this normative model, is focused on decision making. And what that means is that if you're going to use the normative model, you have to have a decision in mind, right? So you have to be thinking about a decision that you want to make, because that's what the model is going to communicate to you. The model is going to tell you how to make that decision, or in what way should you go about making that decision. Should you involve the followers or not in making the decision? Okay, so it's all about decision making. That's very different for this model, so kind of keep that in your mind. So in order to use the normative model, like I said, you have to have a decision that you're trying to make. You also have to have the authority to make the decision. So it's not going to work if you're in a position where a decision needs to be made, but even though you're the leader, you can't actually make that decision. Okay, so it will not work in that situation. So you have to have a specific decision in mind. You have to have the authority to make the decision. And then, of course, you have to have followers, because some of the options that it'll give you will involve the followers. So you have to actually have followers in order to use the model. Okay, so I'm going to go over the different styles, or I guess they're called styles, right? The different styles that you could end up using from the normative model, okay? And they're styles, but they're really just how are you going to handle this decision, right, in this particular situation. So I have them here. Make sure I'm not leaving any out. There are 5. The first one is that you're just going to decide, right? So if you're in a situation where primarily you don't have a lot of time, right? And people are likely to sort of be on your side, etc., then maybe as a leader you should just go ahead and decide it, right? Decide and don't involve anybody else. Of course, this is a more autocratic approach, right? Because you're not involving people, and people might criticize that. The second option is to consult people individually. So I have a former boss who used this option all the time. So he would come around to everybody's offices and he would have some kind of decision that needed to be made, and he would come into each person's office and consult individually with all of us to try to figure out, what did we prefer, what were we thinking, etc. And then he could kind of put all of that together later and make his decision after he had consulted all of us individually. This worked kind of well in that environment because we have some people who had really strong opinions in our department, which meant that if you were all as a group, then maybe not everybody would be able to have their say because the people with really strong opinions would override all that conversation. So it was a good option in that particular case. We also have consulting the group as a whole. So that would mean you'd bring everybody in and you would talk to everybody about it, kind of present the problem, present the possible options, etc., and consult with people, right? See what do they want to do. You are still the leader in this situation, so you're still ultimately going to make the decision, but you're still trying to get some feedback, okay? So you're not just deciding. So as you can see, these are sort of moving progressively more towards a democratic side. So we started at autocratic with you just decide, and we're kind of moving to involve followers a little bit more at each step. So we have consult individually, consult as a group, and then we have facilitate. Okay, so facilitate is more along the lines of they're sort of in charge of making the decision. And the leader is not going to push his or her own ideas on them. The leader is just going to say, hey, we have a decision that needs to be made. Let's talk about it and get some feedback. Okay. And ultimately in that situation, the group is somewhat responsible for making the decision. Okay. But it's still not the most democratic option. The most democratic option is delegate. Delegate is you guys just deal with it, right? So telling the followers, let's discuss, what is the problem? So even you're not even coming in with the problem. You're just saying, y'all talk about the decision and what the issue is and what needs to be done about it. And then you guys make the decision. Okay, so it's very much so putting it out of the leader's hands in that situation. So, okay, 5 styles. Again, they're ranging from more autocratic all the way to more democratic. So we start out with decide, right? So you're just, as a leader, you're going to decide the most autocratic option. Consult individually, right? Consult the group, facilitate, and delegate. And delegate is the most democratic option. Okay, so I can't get your feedback on this, and this is driving me nuts. So hopefully everybody's good. If not, you can rewind this video and then watch me again. All right, so in terms of how you're going to decide which of these to use, this is a prescriptive model. Think about that for a minute. So it's a prescriptive model, which means that it tells you what to do, which means you're going to have a decision tree. And that's really exciting for me because, I like the little decision trees. But backing up just a minute, this is the normative model. There are 2 models, right? There's a time-driven model and there's a development-driven model. So there's actually 2 decision trees, right? There's one if you're functioning under the time-driven model. Here's your decision tree, and if you're functioning under the development-driven model, here's your decision tree. So let me see really quick which pages these are on, just so you can find them in your book. We have the time-driven model on page 129, And the development-driven model is on page 130. Okay, so for this model, right, or for these decision trees, I guess you would say, you answer 7 questions and you basically indicate whether or not the situation is high or low on those different 7 questions. Okay, so we have quite a few. So we'll start out with decision significance, which is how important of a decision is this? Is it really important or not? So basically you're going to have high or low in that particular situation. You then have importance of commitment, and this is how important is it that the followers are on your side, right? That they commit to this idea, that they commit to the decision. If it's not really important at all, then maybe we don't need to involve them as much, right? But if it's really important that they commit to it, then it's gonna be more likely that they're gonna do that if you've actually involved them in the decision to some extent. Okay. The third thing is leader expertise. So if the leader has a really good idea of what they're doing, they're the expert in this situation, this decision that needs to be made, then it's going to lend itself more towards the autocratic side because the leader knows what they're doing and they're the expert. But there are definitely situations where the leader doesn't know as much about what they're doing. In your book, it sort of goes through an example in one of the case studies, I guess you would say, where somebody was doing such a good job being an autocratic leader in a certain situation, and they were promoted, right? Because it was working really well in that situation, etc. They're promoted, but they were promoted into an area where they didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't know the inner workings of that. And they were still trying to use this autocratic style instead of kind of switching into a more democratic style. And it was hazardous. And they were not effective because they didn't know what they were talking about. And so leader expertise is really going to matter. If you don't know what you're talking about, but you're still supposed to lead, then you are probably going to need to use a little bit more of a democratic approach because you need to learn from your followers the best way to proceed in a lot of different ways. Okay, so we've talked about decision significance, how significant is the decision, how important is it that the leaders that the followers commit to you, right, into the decision, and leader expertise. So to what extent do you know what you're doing as a leader? The fourth one is their likelihood of commitment. So what is the likelihood that the followers are going to commit to the decision? So we had sort of like the importance of their commitment, but this is a little different because this is the likelihood of their commitment. Because you might be in a situation where it's super important for them to commit to the decision and very unlikely that they're going to commit to the decision, which will lead you along a different path as opposed to it being really important for them to commit to the decision and them being very likely to commit to the decision. So those are different things, but they both play a role here in the decision tree. The next one is group support for the different objectives. So to what extent does the group already sort of support what's going on, support the objectives, support the overarching nature of the decision that needs to be made? Because that's going to impact to what extent they commit, etc. Group expertise. So do they know what they're doing? So if they really know what they're doing and also leader doesn't really know what they're doing, then that's going to create a different dynamic. I mean, you can imagine also being in a situation where the leader doesn't know what they're doing and the group doesn't know what they're doing, which is bad. But anyway, the last one is team competence. So that is essentially what it sounds like. To what extent is the group of followers competent in what they're doing? What are their skills, etc. Okay, so are they really skilled? Will they be able to figure it out, etc. All right, so what I really want for you to do is to take a decision in your mind. So think of, if you have a situation where you're a leader, you can think of a decision maybe even that you're having to make right now, or a decision that you've made in the past. And I want for you to apply it to these decision trees, because these things are much more likely to stick in your mind and resonate with you if they have some kind of personal application. So if I was making a decision, I could sit here and use the time-driven model. So let's say I don't have a lot of time, so time is costly. So I'm going to use the time-driven model, and I could answer those 7 questions, and it would eventually tell me which of the 5 styles I need to use, right? So do I need to just decide it? Do I need to consult individually? Do I need to consult the group? Do I need to facilitate? Do I need to delegate? And there are some options, even though it's a time-driven model, which means that it's important, like time is really important and costly, and that would sometimes make you not want to talk to the followers. There are still some situations in this decision tree that lend itself to facilitating and delegating, okay, so which are definitely involving the followers. Okay, but then I want you to take the same exact decision and work it through the development-driven model, okay, and see where do you end up there. So if you're working with the same decision, but it's focused more on your follower development as opposed to saving time, then I want to see where you end up, right? And chances are you're going to end up with a different kind of style that's needed using the time-driven model versus the development-driven model. Okay, so I think that that's all for the normative model. Of course, if you have any questions, you can definitely email me about those, and I will do my best to answer those questions by email. In terms of the prescriptive versus descriptive models, I have been talking about that the whole time. So I hope that at this point, if I asked you which models are prescriptive and which models are descriptive, that you would be able to tell me, right? Or at least that you would know enough to get you off on the right track. Remember, prescriptive tells you exactly what to do, right? Those are the ones where you have the decision trees, okay? Because it's saying, answer these questions and here's your outcome. All right, so for the prescriptive models, we have things like Fiedler's contingency model. That was the very first decision tree that we saw. And then we have these normative models, right? They also have decision trees. So those are our prescriptive models. In terms of descriptive models, those are the other 2. So the leadership continuum model was really vague, and it had those 7 different style options, but you were just supposed to consider some things and then decide which of those 7 you thought was most appropriate. We also have the path goal model, which is a little bit better in terms of giving you some direction with the questions and what you're supposed to be doing and which style you should choose, but it's not definitive. So you could easily justify a variety of different styles. Which is why I had to do that in class, because there's no clear right answer. So even if you sat there and told me about your situation, I might have seen that as being more of a supportive situation. If you could say, hey, I think that's achievement oriented and you should use an achievement oriented style here. As long as you can justify it and those justifications make sense with what we know about the achievement oriented style, then that would be fine. Okay, so remember, leadership continuum model, path goal model, both descriptive models. Okay, so that leaves us with sort of the last thing that I told you I was going to talk about, which is this leadership substitutes theory. And I just hinted at that, I think, a little bit on Wednesday, but it is the idea that the leader sometimes just doesn't matter. Okay, so if no matter how they're acting or behaving or what style they're using, what they're doing doesn't really have an impact. And that could be for a variety of different reasons. So I'm just going to give you some different examples of that. The leadership substitutes theory focuses on both substitutes and neutralizers. Okay, so it does not say anything in your book about enhancers, but originally there were enhancers in this model. So we won't have to know those, but so we'll just focus, I guess, on substitutes and neutralizers. So a substitute basically means that the leadership style is redundant or it's just not purposeful because the followers are already sort of fulfilling that in and of themselves. Okay, so hold on one second. My screen went black. Okay, I'm back. All right. So for substitute, so the leadership style is unnecessary or redundant, and so I have some examples here for you. One possible substitute would be if you have really highly skilled workers. Now, we've already been talking about this across the board. You have really highly skilled workers. Of course, this is going to lend you to different kinds of styles because they know what they're doing, they're high in competence, etc. But the leadership substitute theory says that might even make leadership in like purposeless, right? So it doesn't matter what you're doing because they know what to do. They don't need you, right? Especially if you're coming in there with more of a task oriented a style, then it doesn't matter. Okay, because your followers know exactly what they're doing. Okay, another thing is like if you have really routine tasks, well then they can do it, right? I mean, they know how to do it. They do it all day long, over and over and over. So to some extent, the leadership style and behavior isn't going to matter very much. And then also, if you have a really intrinsically satisfying task, so something where your followers already feel really fulfilled in what they're doing, then maybe you don't need your leader hanging around doing anything really because you're happy and you're doing great and you love what you're doing and you're challenged by your work. Why do you need a leader telling you anything else, right? So that would be another possible substitute. Neutralizers are a little bit different because they just basically reduce or limit the effectiveness of the leader. Okay, so here are some examples. If you're a leader that is not near your followers, right? So you're kind of removed from them in a way. I feel like organizations do this a lot where they have managers that are not in the same space as the employees and the followers. Then what that's doing is it's basically making any kind of task directive behavior, any kind of task structure style, it's limiting that effectiveness because they're not in the same space. They're not as connected with the followers as they need to be. Another neutralizer would be if the followers are indifferent to rewards. So you can't motivate them because they don't care about the rewards that are being offered, right? Then that's obviously going to neutralize the effectiveness of the leader. And then also another example is if the leader can't even give rewards, then that could neutralize the effectiveness of the leader. Okay, so in terms of your study guide, I have that pulled up over here. Like I told you, we're just going to do chapter 3 and chapter 4. Not going to have chapter 5 on this exam, but I am probably going to do chapter 5 Wednesday and Friday. Okay, so just keep that in mind. In terms of chapter 3, remember that's behavior, right? Behavior styles and what kind of behavior leaders should use and what kind of behavior is most effective. We also had a lot of stuff in there about motivation. Okay, so remember to focus on the different motivation theories, both the content motivation theories and the process motivation theories. We also talked about reinforcement theory. We talked about it in terms of how we teach it in psychology with the positive and negative punishment, positive, negative reinforcement. There are some different terms in your textbook, so let me go to those really fast because I was looking at those the other day. They talk about extinction, and some of these map on to what we think about in psychology. So what I think I'm going to do is that if you understand positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment and what those mean, then you will be fine on the exam. So I'm going to use that terminology as opposed to the terminology in the book, which makes it just a little bit more confusing because their categories are positive reinforcement, avoidance reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. And they don't really map on exactly to our 4 models. So as long as you're fine with that, I'm going to follow what we're used to in psychology. So if you have any questions about what we're used to in psychology and you don't know what those look like, then feel free to email me. Okay. We've kind of gone over all of chapter 4 stuff. Just make sure that you know this stuff really well and that you can talk about it in a short answer question and then work in the actual terms. I think that was our big problem with exam 1, is that I was asking you these questions that seemed kind of generic in a way, but they weren't generic. They were very much so connected to the course material. So you've got to know the course material in order to answer the short answer questions. So don't forget about that. I think you guys will be okay. And we only have 2 chapters, so that's kind of nice, I guess, in terms of studying. Trying to think. Oh, okay. So just some updates for the future. So exam on Monday. Wednesday we'll talk about power. Friday we're also going to finish talking about power, but you also have your interview document due, and that is not up on Blackboard yet. But it is basically just a document that where you're kind of describing what happened in the interview and maybe some answers to some of your questions. It does not have to be all encompassing. I don't need a transcript of the whole interview. This is just for me to see the gist of what you got out of this interview. And that's going to be due on Friday. So I know that some people have talked to me about issues with getting their interview done by Friday. If you're having a hard time with that, just send me an email, make sure that we kind of get something else worked out, because we have next week and then we have spring break. And then we have the next week, but your full project has to be done by April 8th. So it's sort of like the more the interview gets pushed back, the more the project is going to get pushed back. And that's just not leaving you very much time. So I'm definitely flexible if you really need to do your interview the week after spring break. But if you do that, I would strongly recommend that you go ahead and start talking to your leader by email about some project dates and project possibilities, okay? Because I just don't want you to leave yourself with so little time. I mean, by that point, I don't even know when it is, but when we get back from spring break, let me see. Okay, so when we get back from spring break, that Monday, it's March 14th. Right? And then you have to have your whole project stuff done by April 8th. So that's not a lot of time. So just think a lot about what you want to do about that. I know next week's a tough week with midterms and stuff. But either way could end up being a little bit, like doing it during midterms I know can be inconvenient. And then also putting it off might end up being inconvenient if you don't have a lot of time left to do the project. So just keep those things in mind. Again, if you have questions, send me an email. I'm here for you. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and I hope that watching this video was not too painful, was hopefully very helpful. This is my first video, YouTube video. I'm watching myself right now. And hopefully I'll figure out how to get it on YouTube, and that'll be easy. We'll see. Okay.